Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the November 13th, 2024 Q&A virtual lunch hour with Jason Killeen. I'm your host, Jason Killeen. I'm an Assistant Executive Director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started with the questions, I just want to remind folks that we are in the midst of our 2025 license renewal process. The regular renewal period was extended to December 2nd of 2024. So please make sure that you get your renewal records submitted and get the fees timely paid. The late renewal period will run from December 3rd through December 31st of 2024. For the regular renewal period, the director agreed to provide folks an additional 30-day fee deferral to make sure that they had some additional time to pay. So if the fees are paid by December 2nd, they won't be subject to the expedited services fee time and a half rate, but they will be subject to additional late fees if not timely submitted by December 2nd. The second late renewal period runs from January 1st of 2025 through February 28th of 2025. Late renewals are assessed the expedited services double time rate. And I do want to remind folks that if you don't timely renew before the end of the year, your 2024 license does expire after 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, and a business must cease operating until a new license is issued. So if you are a business that allows your license to expire um, at the end of the year, you will have to stop engaging in activities that you don't possess a license for, or it will be considered unlicensed commercial cannabis activity, which could be grounds to deny your application. So it is important to make sure that you get your renewal submitted and the fees timely paid in order to stay in good standing with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. Folks that don't pay their deferred annual license application fees are not going to be allowed to refile because their annual license application will not be considered filed in the first place. Filing requires that all of the documents, forms, and information are submitted as well as fees are paid. Currently, the records had deferred fees, but those fees are still an outstanding obligation of the applicant or licensee. And if those fees don't get paid, the application is never considered filed, in which case it would not be eligible for refiling because the code requires an application to be first deemed filed in order for it to be eligible for refiling. The renewal fees are set at $1,829 for a record renewal. That is composed of the a la carte fees for the documents that need to be submitted as part of the record renewal process. The temporary approval renewal is for records that have a temporary approval license, but they have not been issued an annual license yet. That renewal fee is $4,233. And then the annual license renewal fee is $8,486. All three of these fees are set by code. The TA renewal and the annual license renewal are set by code under the renewal title. And then the 1829 is set based on the a la carte fees and what documents applicants have to submit as part of the renewal process for next calendar year. Again, those fees are all due by Monday, December 2nd of 2024. Failure to pay those fees by that date will result in the assessment of additional fees on the record. And then the annual license application fee of $76.91 per activity are due on the date specified on your invoice that came to your application record. Please make sure that you're getting those fees timely remitted. If those fees are not remitted and you submit a renewal application, it could be grounds to deny your renewal application because you're not in good standing because of the outstanding fees. So it is important to make sure that you're getting those fees paid in a timely manner. And with that, we can go ahead and get started with questions.
Good afternoon, Jason. Our first question comes from Michael E. Can you please explain what each renewal fee is for We did not see the invoice in our LADCR record.
So going back a slide, there's a record renewal fee of 1,829. That's the sum of the a la carte fees for each of the documents that folks are required to submit as part of their renewal record. Then there is the $4,233 temporary approval application fee, which is set by code. And then the annual license renewal fee is $8,486 per activity set by code. You should have an invoice generated on the corresponding record. If your record has gone through the commission and an annual license has been issued, staff have converted your A&N record to an LIC record to reflect the issuance of the annual license. And the retail storefront, as well as any non-storefront activities, would be migrated over to that one LIC record as well. Invoices should be generated when the renewal is submitted. It'll either be attached to your A&N record or to your LIC record, depending on the record type. If you're not able to find your invoice, I'd recommend reaching out to your analyst, and they can further assist you.
Our next question comes from Clay B. Does the annual license require a new application and a new application fee?
Annual license applications require the payment of the annual license application fee. If an annual license is issued, then the applicant will pay the annual license renewal fee, which is a different fee. Each year there's different renewal requirements, and then it's up to the applicant to make sure that they're submitting the updated documentation required and then meeting all of the inspection and compliance related obligations that they have under the code.
A follow-up question from Clay B. Are license renewal fees still based on estimated revenue? What are the tiers?
DCR's fees have never been based on estimated revenue. The three types of renewal fees at the local level are the record renewal fee, the temporary approval renewal fee, and then the annual license renewal fee. Those are all based on time and materials and a fee study that was conducted. It has nothing to do with revenue estimates. I do believe the state has fees that are tiered based on the estimated revenue that the applicant business would generate or the volume of work that they were going to do, but the local fees are not based on any revenue estimates.
Thank you. Our next question from Fabio F. In one of the last Q&As, it was mentioned that a social equity applicant will have to remain on a social equity license in perpetuity. Does this mean that a social equity applicant will never be able to transfer their 51% share to a non-social equity applicant?
As the code is currently written, a social equity applicant is always a social equity applicant into perpetuity. The department is supportive of an amendment that would allow for social equity applicants to fall below the 51% equity share required. But that's going to be a policy decision that we hope to be taken up in committee sometime in calendar year 2025. Dr. Brown, who is our social equity program director, she's been meeting with stakeholders, and social equity stakeholders have, a very robust and wide range of views as it relates to the equity share requirements and whether or not equity share should be required to be maintained, and what implications dropping that threshold down could have on our ability to compete for grants at the state level and also to administer a social equity program at the local level. So I do anticipate when this item comes up for policy consideration, it'll be a rather robust conversation. But hopefully we'll see movement next year that would allow for a social equity applicant to fall below the 51% threshold. And whether or not that threshold will be maintained at a lesser level or eliminated altogether, and what the time constraints would be, I couldn't speak to that right now, because those are all going to be pending policy considerations. So stay tuned.
Our next question from Ariella J. Ariella J is a two-parter. If an applicant/licensee does not pay the annual application invoice by the deadline, will there be a late period? And then secondly, does the application become automatically abandoned with a status of abandoned eligible for refile if appropriate?
So breaking it down, if an applicant licensee does not pay their annual license application fees, it could either result in the denial of their renewal record, or it could result in the abandonment of the application. If you miss the deadline or are at risk of missing that deadline, please reach out to your analyst. Those fees all have to be paid in the current calendar year. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. If the fees are not paid, the record will expire, and it could be abandoned. If the annual license application fees are not paid, the record is not considered filed in the first place, so it would not be set to a status of abandoned, eligible for refile. It would just be set to a status of abandoned.
Our next question also comes from Ariella. For a vertically integrated company, in the event a licensee does not pay a single renewal activity, but does pay the annual application invoice, will that single activity be eligible for refiling once the temporary approval for that single activity expires after December 31st?
Yes. So in the event a licensee does not pay for a single renewal activity, the activity that is not renewed would be removed from the record for next calendar year. The record that, or the activity that was removed, could be eligible for refiling, because the temporary approval license expired. But the functionality will not be the same. Generally when an applicant or a licensee allows all of their activities to expire, you can initiate the refiling process on the expired record. In the instance where one or more activities are continued and timely renewed, and one or more activities are allowed to expire but later need to be refiled, a DCR licensing analyst would need to assist you in standing up a new application record for the refiling. And you'll have to reach out to our customer support team or your assigned analyst, for assistance in beginning the refiling process for those expired activities.
Our next question from Luis B. Why are we being invoiced to renew temporary approval that expires at the end of this year, as well as pay fees to apply for annual license for next year?
So, talking to your analyst about the fees that have been assessed, is one way to kind of address this specific question. If you have paid your annual license application fee and you have temporary approval, and you submitted your renewal, when you still only had temporary approval, and now your record has, progressed and an annual license has been issued, you would not be paying the temporary approval renewal fee for 2025 and the annual license application fee for 2025. You would only pay the difference in cost between what you paid for the temporary approval and the remaining amount that would be due to pay the full annual license renewal fee. So if you, going back to the fees here, if you had a record and you renewed it and then you got temporary approval before the end of the calendar year, you wouldn't pay the 1829 and the 1420, the 4233 for calendar year 25. If you had already paid the 1829, you're just going to pay the difference. So you would pay an additional $2,404 to basically add to your initial 1829 to reflect that you're getting temporary approval for calendar year 2025. The same thing goes for folks that have temporary approval that meet the annual license application requirements and get an annual license before the end of the year. If you renewed at the TA level for 2025 and you now have your annual license, you'll have to pay the additional $4,253 in addition to what you already paid to meet the requirement for renewing the annual license level for calendar year 2025. It's not both of these fees together. It's the higher of the fee based on where your record gets into by the end of the calendar year, because you're actually renewing for that level for next calendar year. And again, we've tried to make it clear that, we continue to process these records because folks have different state deadlines that they're trying to meet. And the renewal fees are assessed based on where your record is in the current process. And we want everybody to timely renew. And we also want them to be able to get credit for, one, the renewal, plus the advancement in their record if it changes to a higher tier before the end of the calendar year. And, the additional fees would be assessed, and you'd have at least 30 days from the date the additional amount is assessed to pay it without having any late fees applied.
Thanks so much. Question from Rita Y. Is there any way we can be made compliant regarding our application? We've been waiting for some time and it still shows as local compliance underway.
This is a question best addressed by your analyst. Local compliance underway reflects, the document forms and information for your annual license have been submitted. But there are additional components to getting to a notice of complete application. There's the environmental review. There's making sure that your legal business entity record is active, whether it's a general applicant or a social equity applicant. Those legal business entity records have to be reviewed. And if you're a social equity applicant, your equity share review may be pending. So please reach out to your analyst because they can give you more specific information as it relates to your record.
Question from Alex C. When will LA allow retailers to add consumption lounges?
Hopefully sometime in the future. Currently, DCR does not have authorization to accept consumption lounge or on-site or special event permits. That is something that we hope will be added to the list of applications we can process sometime next year. But this is something that will require an amendment to the municipal code. And I expect that this issue is going to be taken up sometime between June 30th, whether it's taken up in committee or it's taken up as part of the budget process, because of course this is an opportunity for both applicants, licensees in the city to generate additional revenue as it relates to cannabis activity within the city. So during the budget process, I know they're always looking for ways to add to revenue to pay for core city functions. And this, of course, is one of those ways to generate additional revenue.
From Charles C., what grant funding is available?
Currently, the social equity team is administering a cannabis equity grant. Um, those grant funds, at least for the current tranche, are available solely to social equity applicants that have a pending annual license application for the type 10 activity. And we have fee waivers that will apply to the application fee for the type 10 activity only. Separately, we have local jurisdiction assistance grant monies, and an amendment was just approved by the state yesterday that will allow for DCR to cover some of the costs associated with the environmental analysis for licensees that currently possess a state provisional license. And currently, those are the only two grant programs that we have funding allocated for to assist applicants.
Charles C. wants to know, what is the cannabis event license type?
The city of LA does not currently accept applications for the special event license, nor have we issued any special event licenses.
From Lucas E., if we have CEQA documentation from the city in hand, like an NOE, notice of exemption, but the DCC says they cannot find it in the state clearinghouse, how would I go about fixing that?
So the way our local process works is we prepare the notice of exemption and then we provide those notices of exemption to the city attorney's office, and their document services group files them with the county. There is a delay in the time from when we hand those documents over to the city attorney when they get filed to the county clerk, and when we get the stamped copies back. Once we get the stamped copies back, we have to upload that into the OPR state clearinghouse. And then that makes those documents available to the Department of Cannabis Control. So we just had, basically everything that's going through commission now, and we're starting to do the, the cases that don't go through commission to get those filed. Those filings are coming back to our office on a rolling basis. And then within, 5 to 10 days, we're getting them uploaded to the state clearinghouse website. So I would recommend checking in if you don't see the document by the end of next week, um, because we have a shared document that we give to the state that has the state clearinghouse numbers. And, we should be able to, at a minimum, provide you with the state clearinghouse number assigned to the county clerk in a file.
Our next question comes from Daniel S. How do we ensure our payments are received by DCR if we never received an invoice, but we can still see that the fees are owed in the portal? And this has apparently happened a few times.
Again, I would recommend reaching out to your analyst for, you know, for certain records where grant funds may be available. Invoices are not automatically generated and added to the documents tab on the record. Those have to be manually reviewed by staff to determine if a fee waiver can be applied. And really, it would just be the annual license application fees that would fall into that category, and specifically annual license fees for the records that start with an LA-R suffix for the type 10. Um, renewal invoices and everything else should be automatically generated by the system. as soon as the renewal record is submitted through the portal. Um, if you can't see it, it may be that the document is on the record, but your user permissions are not set at a level that gives you the ability to review or access those documents. And that could just be based on the contact type assigned to your specific user group for that specific record.
Thank you, Jason. Daniel S. has some questions regarding responses to emails. And he asks, what is your typical response time to an email? What do you suggest if an applicant is not getting a response by email regarding application status? And is there a better way to send follow-up emails or just wait for a response?
I mean, for things that are time sensitive, I would recommend giving the department a call during our normal business hours. Um, when you send emails, especially if you're sending them to multiple email addresses, the folks that are monitoring those emails are kind of aggregating those emails and then getting them routed to the analyst. So, if you're sending 5 different emails to 5 different accounts, once the staff that are monitoring those email accounts, send the reports out to the assigned analyst responsible for that record, instead of them just getting one email, now they're getting 5 emails to do follow-ups. And I know my inbox gets overloaded very quickly, and I know a lot of the licensing analysts have inboxes that get overloaded very quickly for repetitive requests for information. Um, so like I said, it's best to send one email and wait for a response. And if it's something that is urgent, to give us a call during business hours, so that we can follow up directly with the analyst and get you the answer you need.
Our next set of questions come from several individuals about CEQA, David U., Amy P., Anahi T., Crispy, and Emily H. What is the CEQA processing status for each license type? Can you clarify estimated timeframes of completion in these status updates? Will state deadlines be considered in processing of CEQA determination? What should we provide to DCC for the final CEQA determination before the January 1st deadline? And finally, does the state says we must provide final CEQA by November 22nd, but we haven't received annual or paid the $76.91 fee yet. And I could repeat any part of that if you would like, Jason.
That sounds like a lot of stuff is going on, so I will do my best to answer the components. So the CEQA processing status is based on the record type and when your earliest state provisional license would expire. The type 10 activity has to be approved by the commission. So, the licensing team and the commission have processed approximately 300 retail storefront records from early this year through now. To the extent that you have a type 10 record that is getting processed, any non-retail activities for the same applicant at the same location would get processed at the same time. We're starting to process the non-type 10 records, and those are being done on a rolling basis. Your state provisional license expiration is going to drive when we prioritize getting your CEQA documentation cleared. As I mentioned a little while ago, the Department of Cannabis Control has accepted an amendment that is allowing for us to move prior year grant funds into the current budget term to allow for DCR to outsource some of these cases to our environmental consultants for processing. That amendment just got approved yesterday. So our administrative team is going to be working with our CEQA vendors to get funding distributed so that they can start processing these records. And again, the priority processing is going to be based on when the business's state provisional license expires. For businesses that don't have a state provisional license, the business is going to be responsible for paying those environmental fees. And those environmental fees will be assessed before the end of this month. If you do not have a state provisional license, you're not eligible for any fee waivers under the local jurisdiction assistance grant because the state has those funds limited to provisional licensees, and you won't get your adopted environmental until those fees get paid. So I thought the last part of the question was somebody asking about when they were going to get this analysis and they hadn't paid their fees. Unless you have a state deadline that is imminently going to get reached, you're going to have to pay the fees in advance of having the work done. In general, that's how services get provided. The fees get paid, it goes into our processing queue, and then it gets processed. In the event like we've been doing with the fee deferrals while we're waiting for the state to make a determination, we may work on records while we're waiting for that determination. But we have gotten final determinations on all of our grant funds now. So if you're not eligible for a waiver, you will have to pay the fees before the services are done. Did I miss anything?
I think you have everything. I'm looking at the questions again. I think they have been addressed. Thank you. So moving on, a question from Logan F. How does LADCR plan to issue notice of exemption? This is kind of repeat, a notice of exemption for licensees who are pending their annual DCC license?
Subject to the payment of the annual license application fees and the corresponding environmental fees, licensees that are in good standing will be eligible to get their environmental document, which may be a notice of exemption. And once we've completed that analysis, whether it's DCR staff doing it or one of our environmental consultants, those documents would be filed with the appropriate body. The notices of exemption first get filed with the LA County Clerk. And then once we get those documents back, we get them uploaded to the state's clearinghouse. And we also provide the information to the Department of Cannabis Control so that they can see the correspondence of the DCR license with the state record with the environmental clearance. And those notices are going out to the state on a rolling basis.
A follow-up from Logan F. Will the annual fees be a one-time fee, or will this be in addition to the TA renewal fees?
The annual license application fees are one time per activity. If a license is issued, then you would pay the corresponding renewal fees annually for each of those licenses.
Question from Michelle M. How much does it cost to start a cannabis business, and how many licenses do I need?
It will probably cost at least 6 figures to start a cannabis business, if not more. And the licenses you would need will depend on what activities you plan to engage in. There's information on the DCR website about the activities, and then on the state website as well. And both the city and the state have fee tables that are tied to the different activities. So you'd be able to kind of get a general cost estimate just for
Hmm.
application related fees. And then, of course, the cost for securing a location, paying rent, securing a workforce, purchasing product are all additional business costs that you would have to take on as an operator.
Our next question from Jorge T. As the regulations are written, I believe a refiled application is not subject to a finding of undue concentration when refiling in its original community plan area. If the applicant files a pre-app review in another CPA and that pre-application is denied, will the applicant still be able to submit a pre-application in the original CPA if the original CPA has already reached undue concentration?
I think it's conflating a couple of different concepts. So for the purpose of refiling, a refiled application is not subject to a finding of undue concentration, provided it's refiled in its original community plan area. Separately, a refiled application may be filed in any community plan area that has not reached undue concentration. The refiling process does not allow folks to try to refile in an area subject to a finding of undue concentration, because the only way to file in an area subject to a finding of undue concentration is to actually go through the public convenience or necessity process. And the only way to do that would be to file during the limited window when we are accepting PCN applications. Assuming that the mayor and council adopt a slate of legislative amendments that have been proposed by the department, it's our intention to do another verification period in 2025, followed by a lottery, and then running a concurrent PCN process when we administer the lottery. So if you are not refiling in your existing community plan area and you're not filing in a community plan area that has not reached undue concentration, you would have to wait for the public convenience or necessity process to open up, to file a PCN request. And again, that is a standalone process.
Another question from Jorge T. Can an application modify its legal business entity record to add owners or primary personnel at any time in the application process?
Yes, with an asterisk. So if you are submitting modifications to the legal business entity record, that's going to pause the processing of any of your application records, because the legal business entity record needs to be active and resolved before the licensing analyst can deem your annual license application complete. So if you are looking to modify your legal business entity record, you do so with the knowledge of your annual license application being suspended until the modification has been reviewed and processed to completeness and that LBR goes back to an active status. There are certain modification types that are record specific that we would not be able to consider, for phase 3 retail round 1 and phase 3 retail round 2. The social equity individual applicant, that's the qualifying social equity owner on the record, cannot be removed until a license is issued. So if you have a pending application and you're trying to, remove that qualifying social equity individual applicant, you would not be able to completely remove them from the record until such time a license has been issued, whether it's temporary approval or an annual license.
Our question from Steve R. What is the status of LA County's emblem requirement extension? Are retail businesses still required to have an emblem by January 1st, 2025, or has that deadline been extended?
DCR has negotiated an extension with the LA County Department of Public Health. DCR transmitted a report to modify the requirements to comply with that deadline in the municipal code. That report cleared the Plum Committee earlier this month. Council's on recess this week for League of Cities, and we anticipate the Plum Committee report would be scheduled sometime either next week in full City Council or the following week. If City Council adopts the Plum Committee report, then that would request the City Attorney's Office to prepare and present an ordinance to effectuate those changes. And then that would go back through the legislative process. We do work very closely with the Office of the City Attorney, and we do have in-house city attorneys that work solely on cannabis-related issues, and they've worked with us in preparing a draft ordinance. So it's our expectation that that draft would be circulated within the city attorney's office for review and approval, and then for further submission to the city council. We hope to have everything through both the city council draft process and the final review process before the end of the calendar year. One of the things that the Plum Committee did ask the city attorney's office to add is an urgency clause because of the urgency tied to this public health deadline and businesses not being able to operate, or if they do operate, it being a misdemeanor, which would allow for the ordinance to go into effect immediately upon the adoption by city council and then the ratification by the mayor. So, again, we have a short landing strip, but we think that it can be moved through the legislative process and adopted before the end of the calendar year.
Our next question comes from Jose V. When does DCR plan on opening up the PCN process?
Assuming our report gets adopted, I anticipate that it would open up sometime in 2025, around the same time that we would conduct a lottery for the retail storefront type 10 activity license in areas that are not unduly concentrated, and then give folks the opportunity to submit PCN requests in those areas that are considered unduly concentrated at the same time.
Jose V asks, is there any community plan areas that will be added to PCN application process?
Most likely there will be several community plan areas that become unduly concentrated between now and when we administer the next round of PCN application submissions.
From IVC, how could anyone get rejected from the supplemental application? How long is the overall process?
I'm not sure what they're asking about for supplemental application. That's not terminology we use on the licensing side. This may be a question related to the social equity program and supplemental applications that folks may have had to have submitted for direct financial assistance or providing information for their bank accounts to receive some of the direct technical assistance that was provided from one of our earlier CEG grant funds. Assuming that it is social equity program related, you would have to reach out to our social equity program team. And Ethan Spalding is one of the supervisors on the team who normally licensing analysts route questions to.
Thank you, Jason. Kelly M asks, are retail lotteries or licensing applications opening soon?
We're hoping to conduct another lottery sometime in the latter half of 2025.
Kelly also asks, what is the process to change location?
If a business has received a license, temporary approval, or an annual license location, or an annual license, they could submit a business premises relocation modification request through the portal. That modification type would be submitted on the application record you're seeking to modify. If the record was deemed abandoned and is eligible for refiling through the refiling process, you can either submit a new address within the same community plan area, or you could submit a new pre-application in a community plan area that has not reached undue concentration. Those are really the two main ways people um, submit their location. Either it's a relocation request to move a license, or if you've lost site control and the record has been abandoned, you would submit a new location through a new pre-application on the refiled record.
Question from Ariella J. If an existing medical marijuana dispensary was abandoned with an eligible to refile status, can the business entity be substituted in the pre-application process? The code states that you can substitute the entity once, but it is not clear whether that is just intended for sole proprietorship or for a business entity when refiling an abandoned EMMD record.
So an EMMD is considered a general application when a general applicant refiles the record. It has to be refiled as the same applicant entity. The language that was quoted in the second part is only intended for a sole proprietorship, and it's a sole proprietorship that is changing to a different, it's changing to an entity type between the pre-app record and the submission of the annual license record. That was only intended for folks that were maintaining the same BTRC number because that's linked to the same legal business entity record number. And that language is going to be eliminated at some point in the not too near future. So first question, an EMMD can only refile as the same applicant entity.
Thank you. Another question from Ariella. Do the ALA fees have to be paid before abandonment or expiration, or can they be paid upon refiling to remain in good standing?
If the ALA fees are paid before abandonment or expiration, then you know you have the opportunity to refile, provided it wasn't abandoned for some other reason. If you don't pay those fees, those fees will remain on the record. But as part of our budget process, we are going to have to be, we're going to have to transmit a report to the council identifying the uncollected debt that is on our books. And when we make that report, we will be asking to write off that uncollectible debt. And if that record is part of that report and the general fund, basically steps in to make the department whole, and those fees, are written off, and that's reported to our treasurer, then you can no longer get back into good standing. So at most, there's like a 90-day window at the close of the current calendar year. So by March 31st of 2025, if those fees have not been paid, They will be included in a April report to City Council. And once council has acted to write off the uncollected debt, there is no longer a way to come back into good standing.
Question from Steve R. If a Tier 2 SCIA is the owner of 33% interest of a licensed Phase 3 storefront retailer business, can they sell their 33% to another tier of SCIA and have the business remain in compliance? Or does the original SCIA need to hang on to 1%?
I mean, the key word I heard was licensed. So the the original social equity individual applicant, that qualifying applicant can be removed from a record once a license has been issued. The ownership modification process allows for equity to be transferred to other social equity individual applicants, and multiple SCIAs can aggregate their equity interest to meet whatever the minimum percentage is for that particular record. So, in this event where the original SCIA owns 33 and a third percent, they could sell, you know, 33% to a different social equity applicant, and then they could hang on to 1%, and the aggregate amount would be 34%, and then that would still meet the requirements for that record to be considered social equity. Again, if a license has been issued and that original SCIA wants to sell all 33 and a third percent to another social equity applicant, then they would be able to do that.
A question from Tim A. If a licensee has signed and notarized the latest version of the LIC 4005 form, revised July 1st, 23, that was executed in calendar year 2023, are they allowed to submit that form for the 2025 renewal process, or must the licensee sign and notarize an identical copy of the same form for the sole purpose of having the date be calendar year 2024?
If the information on the form itself has not changed, the the form has not changed since 2023, so a previously executed copy can be submitted. If the social equity individual applicant, the business address, the name of the applicant, the person who's authorized to sign on behalf of the applicant entity has changed, you will have to submit a new form.
Another question from Tim A. If a social equity licensee had their annual license application record fee waived, are they required to pay the full $8,486 renewal fee, or only the difference between the annual license application record fee and the 2025 license renewal fee? And then continues, and if the licensee is only required to pay the difference, how may they initiate a refund if they already paid the full $84.86 to the Office of Finance?
Yeah, the renewal fees are separate from the annual license application fees. So if you do have an annual license, you do have to pay the full 84.86 renewal fee per activity, regardless of if you had your application fee waived. We don't unfortunately have any grant monies to waive renewal fees. So if you've already paid the 84.86 to the Office of Finance, thank you. You know, for better or worse, we didn't have any grant fees to waive. So you've at least paid for the one activity you tried to timely renew.
Jason, we have 3 minutes to 1 o'clock, and I wanted to check your time. We do have several more questions.
If you're available, I can probably run another 5 or 10 minutes.
I think that should be okay.
Okay.
Our next question comes from Emily H. What exactly will be required of the Phase 2 Tier 3 applicants in terms of social equity agreement with the city, and when?
So there on the DCR website, on the forms and documents, there's um an attestation that um all social equity applicants are going to have to submit if they're a tier 3 applicant um from phase 2, and that's required to get to a complete, the notice of complete application, because that's part of the application documents. For phase 2 tier 1 tier 2 applicants, they have to go through the equity share review process, and the applicant entity has to be deemed compliant with the requirements of 10420.
From Rakija B. Why haven't invoices been updated for social equity licensees?
There's not enough information in the question for me to provide a response, but the annual license application fees for the type 10 activity are assessed on all of the records, and the way the grant monies for the current tranche are is we don't get one lump sum at the beginning of the grant term. We got a quarter of the grant funds, and then that limits how many waivers we can provide. We apply the waivers, we generate the receipts, we provide that documentation to the state, and once they verify that the funds were expended in compliance with the grant terms, they they release the next quarter of money, and then we go ahead and we apply them to records, and then we rinse and repeat until we get all of the funding. For if you did apply for type 10 and you are a phase 3 retail round 1 or phase 3 retail round 2 applicant, and you're waiting for your type 10 application fee to be waived, um, you can inquire with your analyst to see where your record is on the list, because we're just working our way down the list as monies are available. If you do have other fees on the record that aren't, you know, distribution, manufacturing, cultivation, etc., that would not, you know, get a waiver, you will have to pay those fees. There won't be a waiver coming for them.
Thanks, Jason. This question, similar question came from Rikija B and David U. I can't get hold of my analyst. What is the best way to reach DCR?
I mean, the best way is to call the general office line during office hours, and um, one of our customer support team members will send a communication to your analyst um, to try to have them get in touch with you. Please realize that, analysts have, over 100 cases each between the application records and the renewal records. So they do get a lot of inquiries every day, and they do their best to continue processing records while also responding to those inquiries. So please only try to reach out to your analyst if it's a record specific question and not just a general question about DCR processes.
Next question from Asmeron A. I would like to know if I can enroll in the social equity program for 2025 since I've been waiting. Also, in case I cannot enroll in the social equity program, can I apply for regular retail non-storefront license?
I mean, DCR anticipates opening up a new verification process in 2025. When that process opens, I would encourage you to submit your verification request. And then based on, whether or not you get verified as a social equity individual applicant or not, then follow up with additional questions about what application types you would be eligible to apply for.
Next question from Amy P. What steps should a licensee follow to best concurrently adjust their premises address and perform a change in ownership with the city? This is not a hypothetical relocation, just either a change to the unit numbers within the existing premise address or downsizing of a premises. Within your reply, can you clarify if these two changes can be made concurrently through DCR?
Because the modifications go on two different record types, the modifications can be submitted concurrently, but the ownership change would have to be processed first if it's submitted concurrently, because your legal business entity record is going to have to be active and reflect the current ownership to effectuate the change to the application record where the premises addressed lives. If you have site control of the units and you're downsizing, that would be an updated premises diagram where you're actually reducing the footprint that's already been, approved by the department. If you're expanding out of whatever your current footprint is, whether it's you're taking over an adjacent unit or you're trying to move into different unit numbers that are not currently approved by the department or part of the record, that may have to be done as a business premises relocation. And that can only be done if a license has been issued. So if you submit the premises address modification or a relocation request, that can be reviewed, but it would be reviewed under the current ownership, and we would be looking for effectuating signatures based on the current owners. If ownership has changed and you're reporting that, and you also want to make a change, you'll have to do the ownership change first so that, whoever's signing for the premises diagram or relocation modification is actually authorized to do that. So again, it could be submitted concurrently, but we have to process it in a specific order, just to get the records up to date.
Our next question comes from Anahi T. Will the provisional licenses still be active and permitted to operate past January 1st? Also, can you elaborate on what the state keeps emailing us about regarding the provisional deadline?
So the state provisional licenses are granted for a 1-year term. They don't run with the calendar year. When your license expires in 2025, it cannot be renewed as a provisional license. It can only be renewed as an annual license. So you have individual expiration dates for any of the provisional licenses the state has issued. If you want to continue operating, you need to make sure that you convert over to an annual license before the expiration of your provisional license. Some folks do have provisional licenses that expire in early January. So those license holders are being prioritized through our annual license process. So we can hopefully file their environmental documents so they have what they need to convert to an annual and renew without having to cease operations. Again, the state has a separate licensing regime and system that DCR doesn't have direct access to. So, if they're emailing you about your state license, it's best for you to talk to your state licensing analyst before talking to us, because your state analyst will have more information related to your state license than we will have. And then, of course, depending on what your state analyst says, there may be things your local analyst may be able to help facilitate.
I think we have a chance for one more question. This one comes from Quant Tech Labs, and they are asking, our CEQA notice of exemption has not been added to CEQA.net, and we've been waiting for 3 months. When will this be updated, and what can we do to address this issue as quickly as possible?
I haven't seen the filed documents come back from city attorney that have the required stamp from the county clerk. So it can't be added to CEQA.net until we get that document back. Um, I think there's like 30 something records in their queue that we're hoping to get back over the next week and a half. And this particular record should be one of those. So I, I, I think in the next 10 business days, we should be able to open it up to the CEQA.net, which earlier in the questions was also referred to as the state clearinghouse.
Do you have time for one more, Jason?
Sure.
Okay. Typically, how long does it take to become operational when you acquire a previously owned license?
At least 6 to 12 months to become operational as a new entity. If you're doing an ownership change and the applicant entity is not changing, it would be a considerably shorter period of time. But if you're changing the entity or you're changing the location, you're submitting a brand new application. And then that application has to be, processed through to licensure. And at this point, not every operator is eligible to get a new state provisional license, which means you'd have to go through the full local annual process and the full state process before you would be able to operate. And that could take a minimum of 6 to 12 months.
Thank you, Jason.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. We will not be doing a Q&A session in December. Our first Q&A virtual lunch of the new year will be on January 22nd of 2025 at noon. So I look forward to answering more questions then. I hope everybody has a safe and happy holidays, and we'll touch base again in the new year. Bye.